Welcome to the New Masculine Podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. I find that many people I talk to are constantly evaluating their relationship to social media, myself included, especially as we understand more about the ways algorithms control the information we see and ultimately shape our worldview. That being said, I've also had the beautiful experience through social media of connecting with others who are powerfully using their voices and creating content I greatly admire. My next guest is one of those people. Carson Tueller is a personal performance coach, professional speaker, and disability and diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. He personally identifies as a leader, as a queer man, and as disabled. Much of his online presence focuses on sharing his own journey and elevating the experiences of other disabled people in service of a more inclusive and equitable world. His offerings ask us to confront the micro and macro ways that ableism, or the discrimination and social prejudice in favor of able-bodied people, hurts, limits, and undervalues people with disabilities. Here on The New Masculine, we've discussed the need to unpack and shift behaviors informed by misogyny, racism, and homophobia. It's also clear to me that part of our work, if we truly seek to disrupt outdated models of masculinity, must include deconstructing ableism. Due to the amount of respect I have for him and his work, I'm incredibly grateful he has agreed to join us and add his perspective to our conversations. So, please welcome Carson Tueller to The New Masculine. Welcome and thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for that generous introduction.
Yeah, you're so welcome. As I just love being able to share with people how I see them and how I see their work in the world. It's like it's a fun activity for me to reflect back to somebody what I see in them and see how they respond to it. And I never know how people are going to take it. And I hope that it encapsulates the work you're doing in the world and your perspectives that you're sharing.
Oh yeah. Well, I will say that I wouldn't have wanted to hear it any differently in terms of just you taking what I have shared on social media and being able to see its relationship to other human issues, other human experiences. I mean, certainly ableism and sexism intersect and collide in so many ways, that are totally unchecked and unidentified, undistinguished for most human beings, even the wokest of human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And so, no, it just makes me so happy. And I also have to say, hearing you say Carson identifies as and then disabled actually just kind of like lit me up, because we so often don't think about disability as being an identifier. We think of disability as being kind of like a descriptor of a broken body, but we don't see. So when I say we, the royal we, I'm talking about society. Society typically doesn't think of disability as being this really valid way to identify as a human being, not just to describe that, oh, I'm like, something's quote unquote wrong with my body, but like that I exist in a body that does not fall into the narrow standards of able, and that affects my life. There's a culture attached to that. And there's a lot of beautiful things that come with identifying as disabled that most people don't know about. And so I appreciate you creating this space for me to identify as a disabled man in a really powerful way. So thank you.
I think that's the importance of allowing people to self-identify and to be able to, it's why I include those identifiers in the titles of each episode, is because I really want to be open and surprised by how people connect to their own sense of identity. And I would imagine, and you please tell me if this lands with you or if this feels true to you in your experience, not all disabled people want to identify in that. What's your experience within the disabled community of identifying within that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. First, however anyone wants to identify is totally valid. Doesn't need to be justified, doesn't need to be kind of explained. The way they want to identify is totally valid for them. I will say, when someone patently rejects the label disability, I am always suspicious and 99% maybe accurate at believing that there's some internalized ableism behind that, because there's a rejection of disability because disability comes with so much stigma. I'll also say there are times when people don't identify as disabled because there's so much marginalization, especially in employment in the workplace. So if you say I'm disabled in an interview with an employer, that can really affect the way that your employer views you, because there are certain legal ramifications to that. You can request accommodations, reasonable accommodations, as part of the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. And so there are people who are, especially people who are multiply marginalized, who don't have the luxury of identifying as disabled because they are already struggling to find work, and adding another identity that could marginalize them, that poses a risk to them. So it's really complicated. I have the privilege of identifying as disabled. Also, I don't have a choice most of the time, because I use a wheelchair, I'm paralyzed. So anyone who sees me in real life immediately knows that I'm disabled. And this work at home world has actually been interesting, because I've been provided the choice for the first time since being disabled, whether or not I want to identify. Because right now in this screen on Zoom with you, you can't see that I'm disabled.
Right.
So I have a choice. Do I want to divulge this? Do I want to disclose my disability or not? A lot of people have that, especially people with invisible disabilities. So there's also a privilege to having an invisible disability, because you get to choose in real life, like day to day, whether or not you disclose something. And there are drawbacks to that, because people have a hard time believing you. Occasionally, there's a whole different world of oppression when it comes to invisible disabilities. So there's a lot about identifying that way. But regardless of how people identify, I want them to choose how they identify because it really works for them, not because they think that something's wrong with their body.
Yeah. And so for you, that is an important identifier. That is an important way that you centrally locate yourself at this phase of your life, at least.
Yeah, that's right. And when I say the word disability, what I mean is I kind of use the word disability similarly to the word that I use queer. I mean queer to mean not straight, because it can mean anything inside of like gender identity or sexual orientation. It just means not straight. And when I say I'm disabled, I mean not able-bodied. And so there's a whole spectrum of that experience that I can find myself in. So I just mean I'm not able-bodied. And that makes a lot of space for a ton of people to identify as disabled.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of nuance in this conversation, and I appreciate you being able to sort of share from your perspective and within your identity how you relate to the nuance of this conversation. I think that's helpful for other people to be able to hear, is to sift through it, because it is more nuanced than just disabled, not disabled. There's a lot in there. And so I appreciate you laying out some of what are the nuances that people navigate when they're owning their identity or they're navigating the world as a disabled person.
Yeah, absolutely. I also just want to add that there are still, this is an ongoing conversation in the disability community, because there are still a lot of people who want to identify as like differently abled or handy capable. Those terms generally come from able-bodied people who have an aversion to the word disability because of their internalized ableism. They just don't know that it's ableism. And also a lot of parents are adamant that they say that their children have special needs rather than disabilities. So it's an ongoing conversation. I will tell you that the people who've been doing this work for the longest, who are at the cutting edge of everything that's happened in the world of disability, use disabled as their term because there's no beating around the bush or trying to somehow justify having some level of ability. It's just, we're not able-bodied. We call that disability. And there's nothing to justify. Nothing's wrong here. That's just how our bodies work and don't work.
I love that last thing you just said. There's nothing wrong here. Because I think so much of the conversation can be focused on what's wrong here, or what's broken, or what doesn't work, or what is different.
Yeah. My intention is to have people see disability in the same way that we see, like, I'm going to use a crude example, but like hair color.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, like it is a difference, and it's just a difference. Yeah. Now, this, we get into accessibility and all this other stuff, and certainly all of that is valid. But my point is that there's an experience of a body on a spectrum. We don't look at hair color and say, oh, there's one normal hair color and everything else is a variation of that hair color. But inside of the world of disability justice and ableism, people generally think, oh, there's a normal body. It has 2 arms, 2 legs. It stands. Like if I asked any listener right now to picture a human body, they would probably choose an able body. But that's just one body. And it's not the most valid body. It's not the most worthy body. It's one kind of a million. It's like one color. It's orange. And there's a billion others to choose from. And there's nothing wrong with anything else. It's just a variation.
I think what you're pointing to is that there's often in our minds, and this is a part of ableism, is that we create hierarchies of what is ideal or what is best. And that's such a big, important part of what we've been talking about here on The New Masculine, is around how power is given to only some, and there are hierarchies of who gets power and receives power and is able to use power, and working to really decouple masculinity from power. They don't mean the same thing. We've equated them and we've made them connected, but it's not necessary. It's not a given that that's true. We've made it that way as people. And so I think this concept of hierarchy is playing out in the conversations that I'm holding about the new masculine, as well as you're having around this deconstructing ableism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. They're the same principles.
Yeah.
Right. And essentially, if we were to distill them down, it's that value has been arbitrarily placed on one kind of human over another kind of human. And it's time to disentangle all of that so that people have the experience of being whole and complete as they are in relationship to everybody else.
Well, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your own personal journey of how you're doing that and what you've learned over time about being a man in this culture. So I'd love to hear what comes to mind when you think of, what are the stories that you think of when you think about how you learned to be a man in this world? What are the central components of your life that taught you how to be a man?
Yeah, I would have to, I can't speak to that without mentioning my very religious upbringing in the Mormon church. So I grew up Mormon. My whole family identifies as Mormon or practicing Mormons. And the Mormon church has a really strong emphasis, and not just the church culture, but also the doctrine, the theology has really strong emphasis on sex and gender roles being the same thing. So there's no space for a transgender experience inside of Mormon doctrine. There is only that your biological sex is the same as your gender or should be. And there's a lot of doctrinal backing going long way back that has established that. So you really can't ascend to the level of exaltation or God if you don't follow a very prescribed path that is predetermined by your sex and gender in the church. So, growing up as a little gay boy, I knew that I didn't fall into a lot of those stereotypes, I guess, around masculinity. So I had really non-traditional interests. I wanted to dance. I wanted to play the flute. I wanted to tumble. I wanted to wear dresses and high heels and make paper fans and do all of this stuff that my brothers weren't doing or that my other little boy friends were doing. And I knew that I didn't fall into the stereotypical role as a man. And my dad gave me a lot of space to self-express in that way. He's a clinical psychologist, and that brought some nuance into, I think, emotional awareness and gender expression in my home. So I knew that I was different. I knew I was breaking some of the rules, and I had the freedom to do that. And I thought that I could still move forward, marry a girl, follow that masculine role, and just make it all work.
Oh, I know that story. I've been in that story before. Even not as a
Yeah.
Mormon boy, I knew that story of I can make this work.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have that experience just culturally in I mean, especially, definitely in the United States. And I think it was really pronounced because it was backed by doctrine in my life. So this was not just like, oh, this is what's normal. It's like, no, this is God's unalterable truth,
Mm. So it sounds like some of the messages that are within the Mormon Church, and these are not just relegated to only the Mormon Church. This is something we're dealing with as a culture in general. But it sounds to me like you're saying that there's, even within the Mormon Church, there's a hierarchy of power within who has power, who gets to ascend to God. Even the word ascending into the heaven of God, the kingdom of God, there is this hierarchy of moving upwards, and certain people can do that better than others.
Yeah, there's just space for certain people. So there's literally no narrative inside of Mormon doctrine for a queer person. Mm-hmm. It's just not a part of like the eternal plan. The only narrative they have is like, this is kind of a mistake and we'll get answers in the next life, but this is who you are on earth, and it's kind of a mortal failing. And you'll be straight and cisgender in the next life, and then you can really, take off the way you were supposed to, I guess. So to be clear, like, men and women can both achieve exaltation in the church, and they have different roles. So men are, the role of the man is to provide and preside over the household and to protect. So a very traditional male role, someone who provides resources, someone who, of course, protects the family, and someone who has the authority to do so. And men in the church are the only ones who can hold the priesthood, which is considered the literal power of God. In the Mormon faith, women cannot hold that power. And so all of the decision-making bodies in the church are run by men, just from local congregations all the way up. There are no women who are leading congregations. There are leadership roles for women, but those are only over children or other women.
Well, sounds like a mirror of what's happening in our current political situation.
Yes.
I mean, women are fighting obviously for power positions, and there is movement and betterment in there. But it's amazing how many times that system has been repeated, where mostly white cisgender heterosexual men are the ones that have the authority and power to make choices and decisions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you had the experience of growing up as a gay boy and feeling like, oh yeah, but I can still marry a woman and follow this path.
Oh yeah.
How did that shift for you?
Well, I hit a wall. It literally became impossible for me. I guess not literally, but it was like I would rather die than go that path. And that just became totally clear to me. I got back from my mission. I served a Mormon mission in South America. For 2 years. I got back home, and that is when you are expected to go find a woman and get married in the temple. And it's like time to date. And there are actually congregations of just single people in the church. There are like no families. They're just single people. We call them singles wards. So I went to a singles ward with a bunch of other single males and single girls. And I just was like, I'm not interested in anybody. Any girls is what I should say. I was interested in plenty of guys in my singles ward. I was, trying to contort myself into this form so I could make it to heaven and be good enough and have a family because I didn't want to be eternally damned, And so I was like, okay, I'm going to make this work. And I went on one date that someone set me up on, a blind date. It's terrible. She was so sweet. But
or it's me, not you.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh yeah, she's great.
Yeah.
Totally me. And I was just like, this isn't working. Something's up here, something that I need to really confront and get real with. And that's when I came out. It's because it was just like no longer doable for me.
And so how did that change your ideas of masculinity coming out as a gay man or a queer man?
It opened the floodgates to changing everything because I realized it was like the gateway to everything else unraveling in terms of my assumptions about what is gender, what is sexuality, what is good and bad. Because remember that all of this is like attached to a narrative around morality and sin for me. So in the church, like if I'm gay and homosexual and I get married, then I'm excommunicated and I'm disciplined inside of the church. That policy has become a little bit more nuanced recently, but all of the same doctrine is there. So I realized as I continued to like have conversations with myself, and I did a lot of writing and teasing out of all of these really complicated issues, like really getting to the bottom of like, oh, all of these assumptions are not necessarily true. Like I feel like my best self when I'm pursuing relationships with men. I feel happy. I feel whole and complete. I feel more connected to whatever God is. And I was kind of trying to identify that at the time as well. And then I just decided that I got to say for myself what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be in love with men. And then over time, even got even more nuanced about, okay, like, how do I feel about my gender identity? How do I feel about being a man? I know that I'm interested in kind of sexually aroused by certain bodies and not other certain bodies, but how do I feel about like my own gender expression? So it just was the beginning of a whole lot of really difficult and also beautiful human questions.
Have there continued to be paper fans?
Oh man, there have been, let's see, I'm trying to think of the last time I made a paper fan. There were so many. I would just make like 15 paper fans and just like lay them out all over my bed. And I was like, I'm set. Now I will not run out of paper fans the next time I need to dance to the music on my electronic piano.
Oh, I love that.
Oh yeah, a fan in both hands. You know, you have to have two fans. One was never enough.
Abundance.
Oh yeah. Full effect.
Abundance of queerness. I love it. So you've had the experience of growing up Mormon, believing a certain set of belief systems. You've had to deconstruct some of those belief systems as a gay person in this world, as a queer person. Yeah. You found freedom in that. Totally. I would imagine also being disabled has changed your, or at least the way the world interacts with you and your own self-perception has changed around your manhood or masculinity as a result of disability. Can you share more about that?
Yes, absolutely. If you look inside of any marginalized group or community, you'll still find this hierarchy of bodies, and that like men who are more masculine still have so much more privilege than men who are less masculine presenting or considered more femi, right? I mean, that's certainly the case in the gay male community.
For sure.
And when we look at the disability community, like the individuals who have the most privilege are still the white guys who have the fittest bodies and the most muscles and the most ability, you know, like paraplegics and amputees are at the tip top of the kind of privileged space because, and especially people who acquire disabilities because they still get to be part of the able-bodied club. And that includes me. People see me as like a broken version of able-bodied people. And there's a familiarity inside of that because people can see like, oh, he was like me. And then, well, I could be like him. So I guess we're not so different, right? Because he just had this accident where he broke his neck. So there's so much privilege inside of that. But some of that's tangential, but to get back to your question, masculinity still comes with so much privilege inside of disability. The more like I said, muscular and tough. And I don't want to use the word resilient because I actually think that masculinity kills resilience. I think the word I'm looking for is just like impermeable, just kind of just like, I'll just use the word tough. Yeah, that absolutely lives on inside of disability. So when you're disabled, you kind of become demoted when in terms of like your privilege and your value. And a lot of guys experience that when they become disabled. There's this, people would use the word emasculating because it's the literal descriptor of feeling like suddenly I'm not this like powerful, virile man existing out in the world, right? It's just it's equated to weakness. Yeah. Disability is equated to weakness, and it's not.
And it's not. Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
So how has that emotionally been for you to navigate the emasculation? I mean, first as a man coming out as a queer man, and then coming out and then owning your identity as a disabled person. Like, there's a series of what our culture might say are failures at being a man, those emasculating moments.
Yeah.
How have you emotionally navigated all of that?
I have had to utilize a lot of the same tool set, which is peeling away my interpretation of what's happening. Why does masculinity actually mean that you can like swoop up some damsel in distress and swing on a rope over a giant canyon and, I don't know, save a human being or a human life? Why does it have to be about all of this physical strength? And I would just ask those. I really brought a lot of philosophy into my process as a queer and disabled person. And so ultimately it was like the same work, right? Why do I feel emasculated? What even is emasculation? Because being emasculated implies that there was something to undo in the first place. And do I really believe that there was something to undo? Do I really believe that I lost something when I stopped walking? No, I'm the same person. Is my value really attached to whether or not I can get around walking instead of a wheelchair? No. Right? Like I would just like ask all of these really hard questions and try to prove to myself that I was still either of value or not. And I took a really objective approach. Like, okay, Carson, really prove it. What is it to be weak? What is it to be masculine? What is it to be this or that? And then just kind of slowly teased everything out until I got to the bottom of it and realized it was just a ton of bullshit. Am I allowed to swear here?
Please do.
Okay, great. Yeah, it was just so much shit. And then I just got it. And then I looked around and I was like, oh my gosh, like masculinity, like this idea of masculinity is costing us everything. I looked at all of the straight people in the straight men in my life who kind of adhered to those stereotypical masculine traits. And I could see a massive, I'm not going to use the word weakness, but I could see that they were less effective at coping with life and their emotions. And they couldn't be self-expressed in the ways that I could be because I was willing to feel my emotions. I was willing to give up the idea that emasculation was actually a thing I experienced. And I started to see that everything that I had considered to be like powerful and strong was something that was incredibly limiting for me. And I started to just like roll my eyes every time that I like could tell that men were being put on pedestals for these certain characteristics and attributes that we equate with strength. And I just thought, like, you have no idea. You have no idea what you're losing. The only reason that I came through this at the speed that I did was because I felt every single feeling, because I cried countless nights, because I put my whole life and like vulnerable experiences with grief into an online community. Not that that's what everyone has to do, but I defied so much of that masculine role and could perfectly correlate my progress in power as a result to detangling all of that masculinity.
It's so funny to me hearing you talk and that you, in some ways, were undoing what masculinity was taught to you with pretty masculine inner tool sets, like challenging yourself, by being very analytic about it and very like mind-based rather than emotion-based, and also proving something to yourself, like that sort of challenge. Well, you need to prove it then. Like there's these like really masculine edged tools that you use to undo masculinity within yourself.
Yes, and totally. And I will also say that I went into the depths of my entire emotional experience in a way that I don't see traditional masculine men do, that I knew was considered more vulnerable and feminine, right? And just like fully leaned into all of that. It had to happen side by side with kind of bringing this philosophical approach to life. So it was definitely a both and experience in terms of employing a tool set. And I got that tool set in terms of like that emotional piece from all of my female leaders. I couldn't find myself and the tool set that I needed in most male leaders. I found it in female leaders. And so then I picked that up and I was like, I need this. I want to be like her. And so I read and I studied and then I became like her to the extent that I could.
I love that you're talking about this because it's something that I'm really wrestling with in the work that I'm creating. As I'm creating work that's around supporting men in finding more whole versions of themselves to create safer world for themselves, for their relationships with other men, and with relationships with other people in this world. So much of the models out there of men's work are, I don't find the tool sets to be helpful for me personally. I don't see myself in them, and I don't feel included in those tool sets. And so I'm constantly figuring out like how to create men's spaces that challenge us to own what is our work as men. We can't continue to rely on the women in our lives to do the work for us. We have to take some ownership of where the challenge and the broken parts are, and actually work on those things. But how do we do it in a way that actually is inclusive and that actually lowers the barriers to entry for men of color, that lower the barrier of entries to queer people, that actually feel like safe and inclusive spaces to do the work you're talking about? So I love that you're pointing to that you didn't see yourself in any of that overly masculine style, and that it actually was women that were important models for you, as they've been for me, for sure. Do you have any thoughts about how we create spaces in men that aren't so exclusive or hierarchical, or so much about assessing who has power and who doesn't have power?
I think, I don't know if this is actually an answer to your question, but I think that we need women in leadership roles that are equal to men, both in terms of how broad the reach is, in terms of the quality of how they can influence, right? We just need to be able to learn from and take leadership from more women in a way that will make space for people to actually just show up however they are. Because I think that's what had me have to search out different leaders in the first place, is just men were dominating the spaces that I was in a way that I could tell just didn't resonate with me. It was so much like dog eat dog. It was so much there are winners and losers. It was so focused on winning, proving, gaining power in a way that I was just, it felt so inauthentic to me. And I often listen to male leaders speak, and I can hear that the context of their life is proving that they're better, proving that they're winning, proving that they're powerful, proving they're not weak. Just, it's a constant theme that I hear. And that's why I had to turn to other leaders. And this includes also non-binary leaders. I have many non-binary leaders who I really find my story in. And they're the ones who were like doing the work to actually create a more equitable world where it's not a zero-sum game, and where they were actually authentically living their lives and bringing other people into that win in an authentic way. So
I think it's so right what you're saying. And the challenge in it is that men are indoctrinated their whole lives to prove their power. And so you talked about your own journey of peeling back the meanings that you have made around masculinity, about being emasculated, about being disabled. How do you recommend men start to do that work to peel back the conditioning they have to allow for space for women to have that kind of breadth of influence and power and decision making?
I believe that men will find motivation to do that when they see that their way of being in the world is costing them their lives. That sounds really extreme, maybe, but when any individual can't or doesn't have an emotional awareness of what's going on inside of them and then have the ability to freely speak or feel about whatever's happening, there can never be like a full congruence of self-expression. And for me, that is the essence of life, is being able to peel away everything that's not me and get to the bottom of what I care about and who I am and who I'm committed to being, and then taking action congruent with that. If you can't peel away those layers, you can't enjoy all of the beauty of being totally free in life. Masculinity is a cage. Masculinity is armor. It's heavy. Sure, like you might have this like giant fucking sword and you can destroy anybody, right? But like it's coming at the cost of your own life and well-being. So I would invite men to look at, what is my masculinity costing me? What is it costing to my partner? What is it costing my children? What is it costing my coworkers? Everyone around me? What is it costing them for me to hide my self-expression because of a fear of vulnerability or a fear of weakness? When people start to see, I hope, what they're giving up, there will be a new motivation maybe to take the risk, to show up differently, to be vulnerable, to be human. And, they will get to experience all of the joy and the fruits of that, but they can't until they kind of put down that sword.
Yeah, it does seem like the most clear path, and I think it's probably the most clear path for even you and I as men, is the clearest path to doing this work and allowing your full self-expression in a world that teaches you to be something in order to succeed, is through suffering. Like suffering and the challenges of our lives are what crack us open for those. And that's why women, queer people have been doing so much amazing work, because we've had to go through those dark nights of the souls. We've had to completely fall apart so that we can reconstruct ourselves. And I think we're getting to see some of that happening in the male world. There's a suicide epidemic around, amongst men worldwide that is insanely high. There's mental health challenges with men. Like, in some ways, you could, like, we've seen some of those traditional masculine destructive archetypes a lot lately in our political environment, in the siege on the Capitol. We're getting to see a lot of that, and it can be really easy to look and shame them.
Yeah.
And yet there's also another lens to see how much suffering is there to get to that place. Not from a place of we should feel bad for the behaviors and there shouldn't be accountability, but from an acknowledgement that things are getting pretty bad, and we have the. It does seem to me that it will take recognizing how much this is costing you to start having that conversation. You said something about men checking in with themselves about what their masculinity is costing them, but also asking their partners, their children.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if men were having those conversations where they asked about their impact on their partner, or they asked about the costs of them showing up in certain ways
it would be transformational for a guy to say, hey, what is it costing us, or what's the impact of me not being totally authentic about what's happening in my life, or really showing up vulnerably or expressing to you what I'm feeling.
It gives me chills when you said that. Like, I was thinking about what a powerful practice that could be. Not easy.
Oh my gosh.
To sit through that and to actually listen rather than to come up with your counter argument to it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Or to dominate.
Right. It would take a massive amount of courage to be able to be with the responses to that.
And that redefinition of courage to include things like that's what real courage is. Courage isn't overpowering people. Courage isn't domination. It is about being able to sit with what you're scared of, sit with what feels challenging, and to feel it all.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
Well, I'm so grateful that you've been able to share some of your own personal insights based on the journey that you've had growing up in this world as a queer person, as disabled. I'd really love to hear a little bit more about your work in the world, what you're doing, what your voice is, what you're sharing from your perspective. I kind of gave a synopsis of it in the beginning, but I'd love to hear more from you, what you're creating.
It was a great synopsis. It really was. But I will say, I'm going to preface this by saying I'm going to be totally honest about how it's going, because there's a lot of ups and downs to it. So when I became disabled 7.5 years ago, I realized I kind of like discovered inequity for myself and thought, wow, like disabled people are incredibly underrepresented in every space I look. And like I said earlier, even in the wokest, most progressive spaces, people are not taking into account disability as a community, as a people, as a culture. And so I thought, okay, like we need to raise visibility for that. And so I started talking about ableism. I started connecting more with other disability advocates and leaders in the community. And what we're doing is trying to just raise awareness of what ableism actually is. And to put this in perspective, I want you to imagine, or I want listeners to imagine, living in a world where people didn't even know what the word racism meant, or what the word homophobia meant, or sexism meant. You can't even have a conversation if people don't even know the name of the oppressive structure. That's how far behind the disability justice movement is. And when I say behind, I mean, I don't blame disabled people for that. We don't have the same ability to unify or show up in physical spaces to protest because of accessibility. There are so many nuances to how we have to move forward that limit our ability to to create impact. So now that social media has become a more prevalent part of our lives, disabled people are able to show up in a more equitable way because we have access to social media. There's still inequity in a lot of it, but right now we're just trying to educate people. Like, what is ableism? How do you detect it? What does ableism look like when it collides with other oppressive structures? What are some of the pitfalls of communicating with or interacting with disabled people? What is inspiration porn? How are disabled people used as tragedy stories and objectified as having like terrible life? Just bringing to light all of the ways that people have never, ever thought of this idea that a disabled person could be equally valuable. It's a radical idea. And we're at the space in time where people have never even considered that a disabled body could be of equal value to an able body. And if you did a little test on yourself and you wondered, okay, like how would I feel about myself if suddenly I became a wheelchair user? How would I feel about my worth as a human being? And you'll be able to detect some internalized ableism, right? So I have a lot of different feelings about all of this because it can be easy to feel resigned, especially when other really progressive spaces aren't making space for disabled people. That can be hard. It can feel like we're spinning our wheels. I talk with a lot of disabled people who feel the same kind of resignation and kind of like, what am I even spending my time doing? And the word's getting out. People are listening more. And we're committed, we're committed to really making a difference. So that's what I'm doing in the activism side. And I'm currently in the process of balancing what it feels like, or like balancing my work. Because what really lights me up is working with individuals to become totally unstoppable and powerful in their own personal lives. Working on the macro scale of changing the entire mindset and philosophy about having a human body is a pretty big undertaking. It takes a lot of time to rewrite. And while I do that work that can sometimes feel fruitless, I have incredible experiences with clients, both disabled and able-bodied, queer and straight, and people who identify in all sorts of ways who are achieving incredible results in their lives. And I love my work as a coach. I love my work as a speaker. And both of those spaces are kind of where I get I would say those are the spaces where I am totally self-expressed. And I'm in the process, as you can hear in me sharing this, the process of balancing these two areas of life. And I plan on starting to really develop like the business, personal empowerment, professional development side, because I've had a tremendous amount of success with assisting clients to unleash themselves to be able to live the lives they want. And that's incredibly fulfilling.
It's so interesting to find that balance between what is important to you and your values and also what allows you to fully express yourself. I find that sometimes in my own work around that I'm doing, I love being in the trenches in one-on-one sessions with people. I come from a social work background prior to being a coach, and I love that intimate, deep work that I do with people. And yet my podcast is something I feel really passionate about building and continuing to build its message. And I'm not always the most macro level thinker. I'm much more micro in the trenches with someone. And so I totally feel you on trying to find the balance between all of it. And I do want to reflect that how I have been personally impacted by your work, because I think it is important. Even as you were saying, like, we're so far behind in this conversation because people don't even know the word ableism. I even noticed myself needing to put a definition in the introduction that I wrote to you because I was worried that people wouldn't know what that meant when I said it. And I didn't want to speak in code to people, in what would be code to them.
And your instincts are correct. People would not know what ableism really is or how it looks. Yeah.
And I think it's work like yours in just sharing your story and sharing the story of other people that is waking people up to that, and is why I personally reached out to you to make sure that you were on this podcast, because I wanted to make sure that there was representation on my podcast of other forms of diversity and difference that are important to this conversation. I remember the moment that I decided, I was like, oh, I'm gonna actually reach out to him and see if he'll participate in this conversation. You were sharing a series on Instagram around, and this isn't something you only shared once, but there was a time where you were sharing a series around disabled sexuality.
Oh yeah.
And I found it really impactful to me because as a gay man, I think in our community, we often are overly sexualized, hypersexualized, and we relate to each other through sex. Mm-hmm. But as we relate to the outside world, we're hyposexualized. We are our versions of sex are the grossest thing possible, and we don't talk about it. We don't get to own our sexuality in straight spaces.
Yeah. Right.
And then there's this other layer that you have as a disabled person that was a moment of clicking for me of how sexuality isn't even on the table for most people in terms of the conversation or what they think about with disabled people.
Totally. Yeah.
And so when you were doing that, I had to I watched that inner tension in me that was like, okay, I'm sort of overseeing gay men sexualize themselves, but then I'm watching this disabled person talk about his experience of not being able to have his sexuality and just taking up space and owning it. It really developed something within me to sit with that and watch that. And I just wanted to reflect back to you that I really appreciate you doing that work, because I imagine it's vulnerable.
It's like one of the hardest. I'll say that's one of the hardest areas for me to navigate because I have these competing influences inside of an identity, right? Of like, how do I show up? My Instagram is definitely has an element of like thirst trap to it. I'm aware of that. I'm not stupid.
Yeah.
And I write really substantial things from my heart that move me in terms of things I really care about. And so I'm constantly like, okay, am I like perpetuating this? I'm simultaneously perpetuating a stereotype as a gay white man while also kind of like destroying a stereotype as a disabled person. And I don't know which of those is winning when. So I just keep posting shirtless pics in my wheelchair.
Along your fitness journey.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and I think that paradox that's there, that tension that you feel is what I felt in myself too, because I was like, okay, here's the stereotype and the non-stereotype all at the same time. Here's my judgment of the stereotype and here's my openness to somebody else's experience. And it was like, ooh, how do I find a place where those can coexist? And I think that is some of the most powerful work someone can do is when they hit a place of paradox like that, is sitting with it long enough to find where they can coexist rather than needing to keep it binary. And totally. Keeping it as yes, no, black and white. It needs to finding a space where they coexist. And the magic that happens in that. It's exactly why I reached out to you, because I was like, oh, this developed something within me, and I wanna bring that in to my conversations too.
Yeah, it's very complicated and it's paradoxical, and you said it all. It's just all of those things, and I continue to sit in a paradox. It's never comfortable. I just wish it would be comfortable for a second, but it's not, and that's okay. And so I really just try to check in with like, what is my self-expression at this period of time? Like, do I want to talk about something really substantial and disability related, or do I want to post something that makes me feel sexy and viable and lean into some of that some days and some of that other days? And it's an ebb and flow for sure.
Well, for me, you strike a nice balance of it because I don't typically follow the thirst traps on Instagram. Because of my own stories and my own stuff around that. And so,
sure.
But I think you find a nice balance, and that's why I was like, okay, I'm willing to sit with my own discomfort to see what's really there. And so I appreciate the balance that you do strike in your presentation online.
Mm. Thank you. I appreciate you acknowledging the paradoxical crazy nature of all of it.
Yeah, totally. So as a way of wrapping up our conversation, my conversation is really directed around men and masculinity. And so I'd love to know if you have one piece of advice for men or an offering from your perspective, what would it be that men most need to know or play with or gain?
I would say feel every single feeling. That's really what I would say. Is question and unpack emotions. So I have found that a lot of masculinity can only exist inside of shame and inside of scarcity, and that all of that develops as a symptom of lack of emotional awareness or a lack of a willingness or a capacity to just be with difficult emotions like sadness or grief or frustration or pain. So that would be what I think would be an incredibly powerful step to all of this, is becoming emotionally aware and then expressing and communicating that emotion in a safe space where you can be heard.
And that's difficult for a lot of men to even cross that threshold. And so if you are one of those men that is finding that challenging you feel called to that message, but don't know how to even get started, hire a coach, go to a men's group.
That's great.
Get somebody else to help you with it, because there are those of us who are doing that work with men all the time and that are helping develop that emotional awareness. So if you need help, ask for help. I know that goes against your masculinity, but do it anyways.
It's perfect. Yeah. And I also want to add this, because I think if I were a man listening to this podcast, I mean, like, perhaps that fit some of the stereotypes I've been talking. I could feel a little attacked, or I could feel made wrong. And I don't mean to do that. I mean to make an argument that there's a better way to show up and exist in a way that will actually bring you so much more joy and happiness and self-expression that you may not have ever experienced before. So I know I can come across kind of as maybe blaming or harsh, but my intention for men everywhere, including straight, cis, white, able-bodied men, is that everyone has an opportunity to totally self-express and show up as whole and complete. That's my only commitment.
Thank you for adding that last piece. It's such an important value of mine is that these conversations aren't about shaming men into something, because that doesn't work.
Right.
We can't undo this with shame. And so I appreciate you adding that piece that it is about there is a better way. And some people have taken a few steps in that direction that might have something useful to offer. So start listening. Yeah. So if people want to find out more about your work, want to get in contact with you as a coach, or want to learn more about your disability activism stuff, how might they do that?
Go to my website. You can find me at carsontueller.com, and there's all the space there to contact me, look at coaching, find links to everything else I'm doing in life. So carsontueller.com.
And if people are interested in the paradox of thirst traps and deep, heartfelt thoughts, how might they find that?
They can find all of that in the same place at on Instagram, and my handle is at Carson_Tueller. Just my name with an underscore.
Okay, great. I'll make sure to put all that in the show notes so that people can find you easily.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great.
Well, if people want to get in contact with me, if you're a man that is looking for some help developing that emotional awareness, you can go to my website at travisstock.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Travers03, or you can email me directly at travisstock03@gmail.com. I'm also on Patreon if you're interested in supporting the mission of this podcast and supporting me as I continue to find new guests that are helping us develop a sense of what the new masculine is. Feel free to become a contributor there. It's at patreon.com/thenewmasculine. Thank you so much, Carson, for joining me, for having such a rich and nuanced conversation and helping us really understand where the intersection is between ableism and masculinity. I think there's some really important pieces that we pulled out that help us as men continue to develop a way of showing up for the experiences of others. Something we're not taught as men how to do, and I want to make sure that we continue finding ways to see the journey of other people. So thank you for being a part of that.
Oh, it's been a total pleasure. Thanks for making the space to have such a nuanced conversation.